Hey guys, thanks for joining me. I've done a couple videos now on 12 volt systems where you have a charge controller, you've got a separate 12 volt inverter, you've got a variety, in this case, bus bars, disconnect switches, breakers, and of course a 12 volt battery or battery array. And those are pretty cool, up to about 2,000 watts. But once you get past that, a 48 volt system might be something that you want to consider. And I've got up here a PowMr 48 volt all-in-one inverter charger. And so that's cool because I don't have to have a separate charge controller and a separate inverter and a disconnect switch inside or a breaker between those things. That's all built in right here, including an AC disconnect. So this is pretty cool because it has a lot of smarts built into it that you don't by default get with a system like this. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why you might want to consider a 48 volt system over a 12 volt system. So first of all, a 12 volt system is generally going to require more heavy gauge cable, like maybe 2-aught cable from the battery to the inverter versus 2-gauge cable. And I'll put a couple of examples up here from Amazon on the difference in price for those kind of components. And you'll also pay more for things like breakers and fuses, a little bit more for the 12 volt system. And the reason for that is because the 12 volt system needs to pull about 4 times more current or amps than a 48 volt system. Now let's take a kind of an example just to kind of show you what I'm talking about. So basically watts equals amps times volts. And if we want to figure out particular amps, all we got to do is divide the watts by the volts. So if we take, for example, a 1500 watt space heater, on the AC side, you're basically taking that 120 volts AC and you're dividing that into that 1500 watt load. And what you're going to find out is on the AC side, that requires about 12.5 amps or 12.5 amps of current to provide that 1500 watts. And that's going to be the same whether you're using a 12 volt inverter or a 48 volt inverter, assuming that both of those inverters are actually outputting 120 volts. By the way, you're far more likely to run into 110 volt output on these 12 volt inverters because not all of them will do 120 volts. So just be aware of that. But on the DC output side, where it's pulling power out of a DC battery, the 12 volt system is going to have very different numbers than a 48 volt system to power that same 1500 watt load. So taking that same 1500 watt load as an example, if we look at the 48 volt system and we divide 1500 watts divided by 48, that's going to get us about maybe just a little over 31 amps to provide that 1500 watts being pulled out of that battery system. So our cabling needs to be able to handle that 31 amps. But if we look at the same load on a 12 volt system, all of a sudden we're looking at about, take 1500 divided by 12 volts, and now you're looking at cables that need to support about 125 amps. And those numbers only go up the more load that we put on the inverter. And the higher that current number, the higher that amperage number that we have to pull in order to power a particular load, the heavier gauge wire that we need, the more heat and resistance we are going to generate as a result of that higher current. And that also means we're going to get fewer usable watt hours out of that same rated battery capacity on a 12 volt system than we will on a 48 volt system because of that DC to AC conversion is now less efficient because it's having to generate more heat, more current, etc., etc. Okay, so why not just use a 48 volt system for everything? Why do we even bother with a 12 volt system? Well, with a 48 volt system, this AC inverter is going to have a higher parasitic or no load draw, just in general, a constant power draw than a 12 volt inverter will have. And so that's something to be aware of. So if you don't need more than say about 2000 watts of output, if you're never going to really need more than that, you're just building a small system to power a few things in a shed, well then a 12 volt system still makes sense to do that. But if you think you're going to need more than about 2000 watts output in your setup, well then the 48 volt system starts to become a lot more compelling because of those efficiencies we just talked about. Okay, before we get into the details and kind of how you wire all this up and what specific components you're going to need, let's talk about some of the cool advantages that an all-in-one has over a separate modular system like this 12 volt system. So this all-in-one has a menu system that allows you to go in there and set which charge mode you want to use. And there are several to choose from. So one of them is PV priority, which basically says to always use solar to recharge your batteries as long as a solar input is present. And at night or on very cloudy days, maybe where we're not getting any solar production, you can have it then automatically switch over to grid power, which is coming in on this other side over here. And then you have another mode called mains or grid priority, where it kind of just does the opposite. It will use grid power to charge the battery and then only switch over to solar charging if the grid fails. So it's kind of like a UPS mode for charging your batteries instead of powering loads. And then the other thing that you could do is have it set up in mixed mode. Now what this will do is it'll use both grid and solar power to charge the batteries in the fastest method possible. And you can define the maximum current that you could charge. I think the maximum charge rate, I want to say, is 80 amps. What it will do is preferentially utilize solar input and then supplement whatever, if the solar, say, outputting about 50 amps worth of charge, and then it'll give you the extra 30 from the grid power so that you're maximizing your solar and minimizing what you're consuming off of the grid. And then of course you have a full off-grid option as well, where you can not use grid power. You don't even have to have anything connected here, and then you're charging the battery, and then you're charging the battery with only solar power and not ever having to switch over to grid power. Now those are the charging modes. Now there's also AC output modes. What can you get out of this AC output connection here? Now you can see I've got this wired to this little distribution module here, and we'll talk more about that later, but I bought this off of Amazon. I think it was about 80 bucks, I want to say. But let's talk about the AC output mode. So first one again is called PV priority. So in PV priority mode, the load power is going to always preferentially be supplied by solar, and then if you have loads that are beyond what solar is able to provide, it'll supplement that with grid power as to make up for it. And then if you have excess solar, it'll also charge the batteries with that excess solar, depending on how you have your charge mode set up. But then you also have mains or grid priority, and this is basically equivalent to UPS mode. So it's going to be powering loads, in this case, off of your grid input connection, and then just passing that through to your loads. And if the grid goes down, it automatically switches over to battery power, or inverter power in this case. And then you also have inverter priority. So inverter priority, the load is going to be supplied by the inverter in the battery system. And then if for some reason that gets too low or insufficient from the batteries, if you drop below that low voltage disconnect value that you get to define in the menu system, it'll auto switch over to grid power to keep providing a load. So you're still taking advantage of your battery to pull as little power off the grid as you can get away with, but you still have the grid as backup power in terms of that particular output mode. And so these are some pretty cool options that you have with an all-in-one that you don't really have with a little modular system kind of like this. So let's kind of get into the menu setup and show you how we can set up a few things. It takes a little getting used to, but once you understand the codes and they're all defined nicely in this manual here, it's fairly straightforward, and once you set it, you can kind of just forget it. So let's take a close look at that and see how that works. All right, so taking just a quick look at the display here, you can see that in default view with the inverter turned on, you can see I've got the flashing AC inverter light, which tells me that the inverter is actually turned on. And then we are currently reading 53.1 volts from the battery, and the inverter has got 120 volts output, and that is configurable in the manual. All right, let's jump into the menu and take a look at some of the options that we're going to want to set. So I'll click the Set button, and the first one is just basically the Escape menu, so we can get to Escape to jump back out. And then we are going to go up. All right, so you can see here on menu setting 1, this is what they call work priority mode. It's basically the AC output mode, and it's currently set to utilities or what you would call grid priority or AC priority mode. And this is the default setting. So if I want to set that, I'll press Enter. And what I want to do is I want to set this to inverter priority mode, where it's going to always preferentially pull from the battery power first and then only pull from the grid if necessary, because I want to minimize out here in the shed my reliance on any sort of grid power. So with that selected, I'm going to go up until I get to SBU mode, which is inverter priority mode. So I'm going to hit Enter to lock that in. So parameter 4 here is the battery bypass, and here you're basically defining what voltage do I want to set this to, at which point I am no longer going to draw power from the battery but automatically switch it over to grid power. So I actually don't want 49.2 volts here. That's kind of a high value for that. So I'm going to dial that down to, I think I'm going to go to about 43 and change. Maybe 44. Yeah, let's go to 43.6. I think that's actually probably the default number anyway, but I'm going to stick with that. Parameter 6 is our actual charge mode. So how do we want to charge the batteries? So CUB is basically saying I want to use AC priority. So it's only going to use solar power if the AC is dropped out. I don't really want to do that. I actually want to use a different value. So I'm going to say enter, and then I'm going to set this to OSO, which is only photovoltaic. So basically what I'm telling it is that I only want to charge off solar. I don't want to use grid power at all to charge. I could set this to CSO, which is to use solar charge as a priority and then switch over to AC power if I want to. But in my case, I really don't need to. So I'm going to leave it at solar only. So that's what that one is. I'll enter to lock that in. Let's continue on. This is the maximum charge current. So currently it is set to 10 amps. So I want to charge this at a higher rate than 10 amps. So I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to increase this and say, let's allow us to charge it up to 30 amps. You can go anywhere from 0 to 80 amps on this value. The default is 60, by the way. All right, so parameter 8 allows you to define the battery type. Let's just look at some of the options here. If I go here, I can go up and say this is N. N is ternary lithium. So lithium NMC. I can user define and set all the parameters myself, or I can use sealed lead acid, or I can use flooded lead acid and gel. Now, it's also got a variety of these L, which is lithium iron phosphate. And so the 14 is how many cells are in your individual battery packs. So mine is a 16 cell, so I'm going to change that to L16 and hit enter. So I'm just going to skip back up here to 00 escape, and then I'm just going to get back here and go back out to the main menu. So now I've got it configured the way that I want it, and let's go in and look at some of the wiring down here on the bottom so you can see how this thing is actually wired up. All right, let's take a look at the connections up here. So starting on the right-hand side, this is the solar input. So this will take up to 10 gauge cables, and that's what I've got in here on these contacts. So my solar input comes here on the far right side. My battery input, positive and negative, are right here kind of just to the left of that. So this is really designed for about 2 gauge cable, which again is what I have right there. And then this is the AC output, and then this one is the AC input. Now on the AC input side, I've got just kind of standard, I believe it's probably, probably only 14 gauge cable. So this is not something I'm going to try to do pass-through loads with, certainly not in anywhere more than about 15 amps worth. So that's really all I'm using this primarily just for charging. So this could be wired directly to grid power instead of just an extension cord, kind of like I'm using right here. And you would use heavier gauge cable. Now you can use up to, I think 7 gauge cable or 10 millimeter cable. And that's really the max this is spec'd for. And same over here, up to 7 gauge cable. This again is the AC output side. So the inverter output is pushing it over to here, or it's also coming as a pass-through depending on how you have your inverter set up. So I've got mine with a wire strain that I put in there. Now it doesn't come with that, it comes with this basic little plastic thing. So I took that out and put an actual legit strain relief in. And this comes down and it feeds my little module that I mentioned earlier. Now this is a little distribution module. As I mentioned, it's got individual 20 amp circuits for each of these outlets, these 3-prong outlets. And then I changed out the 80 amp, as I mentioned, with actually a 63 amp, not a 50 amp. I wanted to give myself a little bit of overhead. So a 63 amp breaker, and that's just wired in there. It's very cool. This is actually designed to be portable. If you want to connect a long extension cord with the appropriate gauge cable, you could put this in other places in a shop, for example, or in my case, like I've got it mounted to the wall. So I really like this unit. Again, I bought this on Amazon. Pretty cool little box, very easy to work with. Then of course, down here, I've got my battery connections going to a DC disconnect breaker. And then these, again, 2 gauge cables coming down to my rack mount battery here on the bottom to the appropriate positive and negative terminals. Now my solar output is going over to a solar disconnect. So you always want a solar disconnect, and you definitely want a battery disconnect. Now there's also an AC input disconnect built into this all-in-one, and that's this guy on the side. So if I had this plugged in, I could turn that on. It'll automatically act as a breaker if I try to overload going through the grid power. but I can also disable grid power with just a flick of a button here. So that's kind of cool. They already have that particular one built in. All right, so that's kind of the basics of the wiring. It's very straightforward, just a matter of planning your layout. But there's only basically 4 connections: solar, battery, AC input and AC output, or AC output and AC input. Yeah, that's about it. Oh, real quick, let's talk about grounding. I forgot to mention that. There is a grounding screw on the case here, and if you are not connecting this to an AC input somewhere, you do need to ground this because it is otherwise ungrounded. So you would do that with the connection screw here on the bottom so that you can ground the case. But if you do plug it in to an AC system, like in this case, I'm just using a standard power cord. Well, whether or not you have the AC input activated here on the side, if I just connect it to my AC system using this connector here, it is grounded. I've already checked that to make sure that that is in fact true. So the ground it has continuity whether or not you have the breaker tripped. So the system is basically already grounded if you're making an AC connection, and your AC connection does in fact have a grounding cable, which it should. But if you're not using an AC connection, you do need to take the extra step of grounding this to a ground somewhere, making sure that the case is grounded with this grounding screw on the side. So that's the long and short of grounding. All right, let's talk about the solar input capacity on this 48 volt all-in-one inverter charger. Now, it has a maximum solar input capacity of 5,500 watts. In fact, let me put a spec sheet up here, the plate that's on the side of the box over here. Let me put that up on screen larger so you can read it. But the important one here is the max solar power, 5,500 watts, and a maximum voltage open circuit of 500 volts. And the input range for this is 120 volts up to 450 volts. So you really shouldn't exceed 450 volts. You could get away with, like it says, an open circuit of up to 500 volts. But the other important piece to know is that if you don't generate at least 120 volts, you're not going to charge anything. You're not going to be able to charge your battery bank with this if you don't have at least 120 volts of solar input. And then the other thing that's noteworthy is the maximum input current is 22 amps. So this is why I have my 4 Hyundai 395 watt solar panels that I got from Signature Solar. I bought those specifically for this particular test so that I could adequately get more than 120 volts, because my 800 watt array won't give me even 100 volts. But the voltage open circuit on those Hyundai panels is just under 50 volts. So with 4 of them strung in series, that's, if we just call it 50 times 4, that's just about 200 volts. It's actually just slightly less than that. Again, that's an open circuit, so it's normally going to be a little lower than that under normal operating conditions anyway. But that's what we're working with. Now, one thing I do want to point out, because this is kind of interesting, you always do want to check the volts output of your configuration before you connect it to your charge controller or your inverter charger. But look outside here. We have got such overcast conditions this afternoon that I couldn't even tell you where the sun is in the sky. It's that thick in the cloud cover. And you would think with this kind of cloud cover, the voltage output from these panels is going to be very, very low. Well, you might be surprised. Let's go ahead and check that. The current most certainly will be low, because that is the thing that's most affected by the lack of sunlight or the presence of sunlight. But I'm going to go ahead and put my multimeter leads up there. And I'm reading volts DC. We got 173.5 volts. So even though I couldn't even tell you where the sun is in the sky, that 4-panel array with a volt open circuit rating of approximately, call it 196 volts, is still producing 173 volts. So it's really important to understand that. And you do not want to connect a solar array to a charge controller or an inverter charger until you have first measured the volts with a multimeter. That is really a critical thing to do, because if you exceed the max input voltage on a charge controller, and I'm in no danger of doing that on this one, by the way, because it's 500 volts, but if you exceed that 500 volts, you will damage that charge controller, and it will not, you probably void the warranty by doing that. I don't think they're going to cover that under warranty. So make sure that you always take care to measure the voltage before you make the connection and know what your maximum voltage is. All right, I thought it would be interesting to go ahead and set the AC output mode to utility priority or grid priority, which basically makes it act like a UPS. And I wanted to test that and just to see how it works. If I put a close-up of this on screen right here, the display on the inverter shows that it's in bypass mode right now because I have grid power coming in through right here. And I have on my little laptop here being plugged into the AC output on my little distribution box. It is running some disk mark utilities to put a little bit of load on it to keep it busy. I have the battery removed, so any disruption in power to the laptop will cause it to shut down immediately. So what we're going to do is see how fast, or if it is sufficiently fast to switch over from bypass or pass through AC grid mode to battery mode. So let's simulate that and see what happens. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Now I did hear a click up there, and the AC inverter light is now flashing. The laptop is still running. It does no longer say bypass mode, and we are now pulling slightly more amperage on the battery than we were before. And that is because the load has been shifted to battery power. All right, just for fun, let's see what happens if we go the other way. So we're currently running off battery power. Let's see if it'll automatically switch over to grid power once I plug it back in. So here we go. There, and I just heard it switch over. And you can see that the AC inverter button is now solid. It's not flashing. The power draw on the battery has dropped again. But again, we didn't really change anything here. Laptop continues to stay running. And we are once again in bypass mode. So it works both directions. So this all-in-one inverter charger actually makes a really nice uninterruptible home backup power solution if you want to use it in that way. Now I did do a no-load draw test on this PowMr all-in-one charger inverter. Since it is a 5,000 watt inverter, I wanted to see how much power it actually draws. And it seems to draw about 38 watts continuously. So I would recommend that you would either enable the power save function in the menu, which automatically disables or shuts down the inverter to keep it from just continually drawing power if it doesn't detect a load for a period of time. Or you can just manually turn the inverter off with the little rocker switch over here on the left-hand side. So that's an option too. But of course, that's all kind of a non-issue if you've got it grid tied over here with this AC input cable, kind of something you wouldn't even need to worry about. And by the way, PowMr does make several versions of this 48 volt 5,000 watt inverter, at least a couple versions. And so if you needed, for example, 240 volt split phase output, they do make a version of this that will allow you to connect them in parallel and configure a split phase 240 volt output. This particular version is 120 volts only, as you may have figured out already. So that does not have this option. You need to buy this. If that's something you maybe want in the future, you would want to buy the one that at least has that option already built in, and then you could just add a second unit and connect them to get 240 volt split phase. Now in terms of price, this particular 120 volt version is right around $650, depending on whether you buy it from Amazon US or you get it direct from PowMr's website. And I'll of course leave links to those below if you want to go check them out. But so if you happen to be looking to maybe build a 48 volt system for your garage or workshop, or maybe an off-grid type of application, maybe even a home backup UPS system, a kind of a DIY system, and you don't want to break the bank, this is really an accessible way to do that, to kind of start getting into that. At 650 bucks, it is way less expensive than a lot of the other options in that kind of product space. I'll also check with PowMr and see if they've got a promotional code that maybe I can share with you that might save a few extra bucks. If they do, I'll include that in the description below, along with the links to the product if you want to go check that out. Okay, I think that about wraps it up for this video. I'm pretty sure we covered most of the bases. Hopefully, if I missed something, let me know in the comments below and I'll try to answer it. Hopefully you found something in there that was informative in some way. If you did, please consider clicking the like button for me. I'd really appreciate that. I will be doing a follow-up video on the 48 volt battery that's just out of shot here. I'm going to do a review on this and kind of see if that might be something you want to take a look at if you're also building a 48 volt system. And yeah, so stay tuned for that. I do hope you'll join me for the next one. Until then, have fun out there.